My sister forged my signature to steal our mother's house. I found out at the funeral. I found out my sister had forged my signature on our mother's estate documents while I was standing in a funeral home, 3 days after burying the woman whose house had apparently already stopped being half mine. That's the timeline that still gets to me most when I tell this story. Not the betrayal itself, but how quickly it happened, how little time she gave grief before she moved. My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 45. My mother, Ruth, passed away 8 months ago after a long decline from heart failure, and I want to say clearly that this story isn't really about her. It's about what happened between my sister and me in the weeks that followed, though I think Mom would have had plenty to say about it if she'd been able to. My sister Camille is 3 years older than me. We'd never been especially close, even as kids, though I'd always attributed that to ordinary sibling temperament differences rather than anything deeper. She'd moved back in with Mom about 4 years before she passed, ostensibly to help with caregiving as Mom's health declined, while I lived 2 states away with my husband and kids, visiting when I could, but relying heavily on Camille's updates about Mom's day-to-day condition. I want to be honest that I felt guilty about that arrangement the entire time. Guilty that Camille was doing the daily, exhausting work of caregiving while I got to visit for holidays and video call on weekends. I sent money regularly to help with expenses. I assumed, the way you assume things about family without examining them too closely, that we were partners in this, even from a distance. Mom's will, drafted years earlier when both of us were on good terms and neither of us anticipated needing to think carefully about it, split her estate evenly between Camille and me. The house, modest savings, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to our grandmother. Straightforward, uncomplicated, the kind of will you write assuming your children will simply handle things fairly once you're gone. Mom passed on a Tuesday in early spring. I flew in immediately, and the days that followed blur together in the specific way grief blurs things. Arranging the funeral, notifying relatives, the strange logistics of death that nobody prepares you for. Camille handled most of the practical arrangements, which I was grateful for at the time, given how far away I lived and how little bandwidth I had for logistics, while also trying to simply feel my feelings about losing my mother. At the funeral itself, an attorney I didn't recognize approached me during the reception afterward, which struck me as unusual timing even then, though I chalked it up to awkward professional necessity. "Miss Cole," he said, "I wanted to confirm you received the executor documents we sent last month." I told him I hadn't received anything. He looked confused, then concerned. "The quitclaim deed transferring the property into Camille's sole name, you signed that in February, correct?" I stood there in a funeral home, still wearing black, trying to process a sentence that made no sense to me. "I've never signed anything like that. I haven't seen any documents." His expression shifted into something more careful. "I have a signed copy in our files. I assumed, given both signatures were present." "I didn't sign it," I said, my voice louder than I meant it to be, loud enough that a few relatives nearby glanced over. I want to be honest about what happened in the days after that conversation, because it wasn't clean or immediate. I didn't confront Camille at the reception, in front of extended family, though part of me wanted to. I went home that night and sat with my husband, going over what the attorney had told me, trying to convince myself there'd been some clerical error, some reasonable explanation that didn't require me to believe my sister had forged my signature on a legal document transferring our mother's house into her name alone. I requested a copy of the document from the attorney's office the following week. When it arrived, I stared at a signature that was almost my handwriting, close enough to pass a casual glance, wrong enough that I knew immediately, with total certainty, that I had never written it. I called Camille that evening. I remember trying to keep my voice level, giving her every opportunity to explain something I desperately wanted to have an innocent explanation. "Camille, I need you to tell me about the quitclaim deed." There was a pause on the line, the specific kind of pause that tells you everything before any words follow it. "I was going to talk to you about that," she said. "Talk to me about forging my signature." Another pause. "It's not what it sounds like." "Then tell me what it sounds like, because right now it sounds exactly like what it is." She started talking quickly then, the words tumbling out in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this explanation, or at least thought about it enough to have a version ready. She said she'd done everything for Mom for 4 years, that I'd barely been present, that she deserved the house more than I did, given everything she'd sacrificed, that she'd always intended to give me my share of the savings account to make it fair, that she just needed the house specifically because she'd already been living there and couldn't afford to buy anywhere else. "None of that gives you the right to forge my name on a legal document," I said. "I didn't think you'd fight me on it," she said, which struck me, even in the moment, as an almost unbelievably revealing thing to say. Not a denial, Not an apology, just an acknowledgement that her plan had been contingent on me simply not noticing or not caring enough to push back. I consulted an attorney of my own the following week, who explained, in the careful, measured way lawyers deliver bad news wrapped in professional language, that forging a signature on a property transfer document was not simply a family dispute to be worked out privately. It constituted fraud, potentially criminal in nature, separate from whatever civil claim I had to challenge the deed's validity. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges against your sister?" he asked. I sat with that question for a long time. I want to be honest that even after everything, some old reflexive part of me recoiled at the idea of my sister facing criminal prosecution because of me. But I also understood that not pursuing it meant, functionally, telling her the forgery had worked, that stealing from me carried no real consequence beyond an uncomfortable phone call. We proceeded first with a civil action to invalidate the deed, which moved relatively quickly once handwriting analysis confirmed what I already knew, that the signature wasn't mine. Compared against multiple documents I'd legitimately signed over the years, the deed was voided. The house reverted to being part of the estate, to be handled according to Mom's actual will, splitting it evenly as she'd intended. Camille, facing both the civil ruling and the threat of criminal fraud charges, ultimately negotiated a plea agreement, a felony forgery charge, probation rather than incarceration given her lack of prior record, along with a formal restitution order covering my legal costs. I want to be honest about the aftermath, because I think people expect stories like this to end in either total estrangement or eventual reconciliation, and my situation has ended up somewhere messier than either of those clean outcomes. Camille and I don't speak, beyond the occasional necessary logistical exchange about the estate's final closure. I don't know if we ever will again, and I've made a kind of uneasy peace with that uncertainty. What I understand now, in a way I didn't before any of this happened, is that grief creates a specific kind of vulnerability that people are capable of exploiting. Even people who share your blood, even people you spent your whole life assuming were fundamentally on your side. I don't think Camille set out years in advance to become someone who'd forge her sister's signature. I think, the way these things often go, one difficult year of caregiving became a resentment, became a rationalization, became a decision made in the exhausted, grief-fogged days right after our mother's death, when she assumed I'd be too devastated, too far away, too trusting to ever actually check. She was almost right. It took one attorney, doing his job carefully at exactly the wrong moment, standing in a funeral home, for me to find out otherwise. If this story affected you, tell me in the comments. Do you think grief ever excuses this kind of decision, even partially? Or is a betrayal like this simply a betrayal regardless of the circumstances surrounding it? Subscribe for more true stories like this one.